The kind of moment every curator or archivist or musician dreams of, finding a previously unknown work by a great master. Imagine the rush as the...
It's not every day that 19th century composers make 21st century headlines, but Chopin managed to squeeze his way into the news cycle in the fall of 2024, 175 years after his death.
Now, let's squeeze in one more story this hour. It's a fascinating story because a new piece of music, believed to be by the Polish composer Chopin, has been discovered nearly 200 years after it was written. The unknown waltz.
On October 27, 2024, the New York Times broke a story about the unearthing of an unknown composition in the hand of Frédéric Chopin. The piece, titled Waltz, is a true miniature, both in the brevity of the composition and in the size of the manuscript, which is no larger than a postcard. It was discovered in a collection in the Morgan Library in New York City. Outside experts were called in to examine the document, and as the Times reported, quote, "The work is likely a waltz by Frédéric Chopin, the great fantasist of the Romantic era." The only thing on that little postcard that was determined not to be in the hand of Chopin was the name Chopin itself, adding an element of mystery to the piece. Welcome to the Chopin Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Laude, and over the course of this 16-part series, we'll be diving deep into the music of Frédéric Chopin, with episodes dedicated to each of Chopin's major compositional genres. This is episode 7, a special investigation into the newly discovered waltz in A minor attributed to Chopin. As the manuscript's chain of ownership continues to be researched and more work is done to verify the music's authorship, we're joined by 3 of the world's leading Chopin scholars to share their expert insights on this long-lost waltz. Beginning from a position of skepticism, Chopin biographer Alan Walker will pose 5 open questions about the music itself, confronting some of the unusual aspects of the score that would need to be explained before making any stronger claims that this is Chopin's original composition. We will then turn to 2 other scholars who will each offer explanations for these oddities and provide insights on the considerations and methods that go into research on the printed sources for Chopin's works more generally. First, Professor of Music at the University of Cambridge, John Rink, who was consulted during the Morgan Library's authentication process of the manuscript. And finally, the man at the center of that process, music historian and professor at the University of Pennsylvania, Jeffrey Kahlberg, who was among the experts commissioned by the Morgan to examine the document. This podcast is produced in partnership with the Chopin Foundation of the United States, whose semi-annual publication Polonaise has previously printed articles by our first guest, Alan Walker, professor emeritus at McMaster University in Ontario, Canada, and author of Frédéric Chopin, A Life and Times. The following segment was produced by a colleague and fellow piano enthusiast, Joe Sabia, who caught up with Walker over a Zoom call in the weeks following the discovery of the manuscript.
As we all know, a couple of weeks ago, the Morgan Library announced that it had discovered in its archives an unknown composition of Chopin, a waltz, which had not been catalogued and which was revealed to the world through the New York Times and statements issued formally by the Morgan Library itself. The provenance of this particular manuscript has never been proved. We know that it was handed many years ago to the Morgan Library by a collector, and this particular postcard suddenly came to light, and bingo, the name Chopin was on the top. The manuscript of this so-called Chopin Waltz is genuine. Forensic testing of the paper and the ink has shown that they're of a kind that Chopin used in Paris in the 1830s. But I'm of the opinion that scientists should not be given the last word on an issue which is essentially a musical problem. The composition appears to be bereft of any musical significance. The most that can be said of this piece, I think, is that it's possibly a remnant of some work in progress that Chopin never finished, and possibly this sketch was destined to end up in Chopin's waste paper basket. During the last couple of weeks, when I've observed all the fuss being made about this little postcard, I've been asking myself, why did the Morgan Library keep it under wraps? and make such a big deal of it. 15, 20 years ago, the document would have been discovered, uncatalogued. It would have been brought out of the archives, put on display, and the rest of the world would have come along to admire this document attributed to Chopin. But what we experienced a couple of weeks ago was quite different. This was a tightly guarded secret. Experts were brought in, sworn to confidence, I imagine, to give their views in support of the authenticity of the document. Everything was kept under wraps until a couple of weeks ago. The New York Times announced the big discovery, and the Morgan Library started giving interviews about this precious document. The brouhaha, which has meanwhile resulted, I can only think that this is what was intended in the first place. It is not up to us, the rest of the world, to disprove this document. It is up to those who promote this document as being genuine to prove that it is genuine. But the burden of proof is never on us, it's always on them. In order to prove or disprove its authenticity, I think it's useful to pause at this point and ask 5 questions. And if the answers to these 5 questions are no, then the likelihood is that all we have before us is a kind of shaving from the master's workbench, which is of interest, but it's certainly not worthy of all the international veneration that it's presently receiving. And it will surely turn out to be one of the major musical embarrassments of our time. Question number 1. Can you identify another Chopin waltz containing the dynamic marking Triple-forte? Now take a look at bar 7 of the original manuscript, and you'll see what I'm talking about. There are Triple-forte signs in the F minor ballad, in the B minor scherzo, in the last of the 24 preludes, the one in D minor, and in 1 or 2 of the etudes, especially the Winter Wind, Opus 25. But the Triple-forte markings in Chopin are very rare, and there's not a single instance in the waltzes. This marking, by the way, generally turns up towards the climactic ending of a piece and never near the beginning, as it does in this particular manuscript. So question number 2, can you identify another Chopin waltz containing heavily marked accents, sforzandi, on the 3rd beat? And take a look at bars 2, 4, and 5 of the manuscript. They suggest a mazurka rather than a waltz. Now, there are sforzando markings throughout Chopin's music, of course, including the waltzes, but there is not a single sforzando mark to be found on the 3rd beat of any of Chopin's waltzes. For the rest, who ever heard of a waltz with the accent on the 3rd beat? It just doesn't happen. Question number 3. Can you identify another Chopin waltz containing full clusters of left-hand chords filling out 2 measures instead of the spaced-out harmonies of the regular waltz rhythm? 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. It's omnipresent in a typical waltz. But in this particular case, when it's most needed, it's abandoned in favor of those chord clusters that I mentioned. The waltz rhythm simply disappears, and with it, any possible identity of this particular piece with a waltz. The idea of calling it a waltz might never have arisen, but there is, of course, at the very top of the manuscript, the penciled inscription, Valse. The experts have said that that is in Chopin's handwriting. I think that is still out there to be proved or disproved. It's something still to be looked at. Which brings us to question number 4. Can you identify from the physical feel of the music's texture across the keyboard that it's actually by Chopin? Now, this opens up a vast topic, but we all know, especially the pianists among us, that his music is renowned for its physical connection between the ivories and the fingers. A professional pianist who knows Chopin's music well and can play certain pieces from memory, even with closed eyes, he will know at once whether or not he's connecting with a genuine article or not. Now, take a look at bar 7. The right-hand fingering for the minor third, D down to F, or up to F rather, it's followed immediately by the second finger going down to an A sharp. Now, try that on a keyboard, moving at speed, and you'll have to admit it's clumsy. I would actually call it bizarre. A better fingering might be 5-3-1, going down to the entire keyboard until those 2 bars are finished. And it's far easier to play and far more Chopinesque in feeling. But it's the only fingering in the entire piece that the author, Chopin or whoever it was, put it in that particular place, and it's clumsy, and we have to ask, why is it there? When you look at all of Chopin's works, you can't find a single example where he's provided fingering that he's later corrected, which isn't to say they don't exist, but they're so rare that I think they would have been drawn to our attention by now. There are many passages which, at first sight, appear to be awkwardly fingered, but that's because the organist in Chopin comes out, and he doesn't like the right foot, the sustaining pedal, to do the work of the right hand. So he's always looking for fingering which will sustain the line. I mean, there are bars in the Berceuse which look at first sight impossible, finger twisting measures, but once you've mastered them, you realize that they're there for a purpose, and that is to sustain the melody, to sustain the legato, not to have, as I say, the right foot do the work of the hand. Now, while we're on the topic of notation, what are we going to make of the semiquaver triplet, the 16th-note triplet in bar 10, which was mistakenly written instead of a quaver triplet or a 8th-note triplet? That's basically a notation mistake or oversight made by a beginner, which brings us to question number 5. And I think this is a very important question. We have to give it due consideration. I can't think of another Chopin waltz which repeats its own introduction. Now, if you look at the structure of this manuscript, the structure is quite clear. It's 24 measures. The first 8 measures, the first 8 bars, are nothing but a virtuosic flourish, and they're introductory in character. Now, the waltz theme proper, if that's what it is, it begins at bar 9, and it runs for 16 bars, divided into 2 groups of 8 bars each. And the entire thing is then repeated from the beginning. In other words, we get those 8 bars of introduction all over again. Now, looking at Chopin's entire output, there are several waltzes with introductions. Among them, possibly the most familiar would be the Grand Valse Brillante, the one in E-flat major, opus 18, and then chronologically the one that came after that, the one in F major, opus 34, and even, now I think about it, the Juvenile Waltz in E minor, published after his death, of course, and he composed it while he was still a teenager. But in every case, while Chopin recapitulates the main theme of these waltzes, he never once goes back to the introduction. That is to say, we only hear it once. But in the case of this particular manuscript that we're talking about, he plays the introduction again, which immediately raises, in my ears at any rate, a red flag. Reviewing all these 5 questions, I have to admit that my observations are minuscule. But when you aggregate them, when you put them all together, they do amount to a significant challenge, something that we have to look at carefully. And I'm reminded of this aphorism of Johann von Goethe, that the smallest hair casts its shadows. There are shadows aplenty visible on this manuscript. This raises another topic, of course, and that is the authenticity of the graphology, of the notation on the manuscript. Many experts have come forward and said that there's absolutely no doubt that this is in Chopin's handwriting. And I have to admit that they have a very strong case, because it looks very much like other manuscripts of Chopin with which we're all familiar. Since I'm playing devil's advocate, that not enough attention has been given to the possibility that the notation may be in the hand of Julian Fontana. Fontana was Chopin's Polish friend from boyhood. Fontana was his copyist, his amanuensis, and the editor of all of his posthumous works. Fontana shared an apartment with Chopin on the Rue de la Chaussée d'Antin during the years 1836 to 1838, the very period in which the experts are saying this manuscript belongs. He saw Chopin on a daily basis during this period, and he was preparing fair copies for Chopin's publishers. His graphology has often been confused with that of Chopin. We have to remember that he was a wonderful musician, he was a fine pianist, he was a composer of a great deal of piano music, which Chopin, incidentally, didn't particularly admire. Now, I'm not saying that the piece is by Fontana, and I'm not saying that the possibility ought not to be discounted. Look at this page of Chopin's Allegro de Concert in the hand of Fontana, which, by the way, is also in the Morgan Library. When you compare these two manuscripts, one can understand how the experts might be confused. And while we're looking at the original postcard-sized manuscript, by the way, let me draw your attention to the word Chopin at the very top of the manuscript. We know with certainty that this writing is not in Chopin's hand. So it was added after, maybe a long time after, the notation on the manuscript itself was placed there. Another question mark over a rather questionable piece. I suppose we have to hold fast to the winged words of the philosopher and statesman Francis Bacon. Truth is the daughter of time, not of authority. Now, it's going to acquire a lot of patience, which admittedly is in short supply in this particular case. But in the end, Francis Bacon is correct. Truth is the daughter of time, and only time, in the end, will tell.